Hello, everybody. Hello, hello, and welcome to today's lecture. We are very, very pleased to have with us a distinguished journalist from the New York Times, Larry Rohter. This is an event that has many sponsors, and I have to write them down. There are so many, and I don't want to miss anybody. Obviously, the Rohatyn Center for Global Affairs, of which I'm acting director today, the Center for Careers and Internships, the Latin American Studies Program, the Christian A. Johnson Economics Fund, the International Politics and Economics Program, the Departments of Political Science, Spanish and Portuguese, and Middlebury and Washington, D.C., who we see projected here on the screen. Many of us, I believe, have grown up, perhaps, reading about events outside the United States that were written by our speaker today. Larry has spent many, many years covering events in Latin America, in the Southern Cone, Central America, in Mexico. He has held a number of positions at the Post, at the New York Times, and prior to that, he worked for Newsweek. I can recall, actually, as a graduate student, reading some of his work on the negotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement. He covered the wars in Central America, U.S. foreign policy during the 1980s. My colleague, David Stahl, in the Sociology and Anthropology Department, wrote to me and said that Larry was almost single-handedly responsible for getting his book on Rigoberto Menchú posted on the front page of the New York Times, and that he owed a debt of gratitude to Mr. Rohter. Larry holds advanced degrees from Georgetown University. He, as I said, is an award-winning journalist. He has won awards both from Columbia University and from the government of Brazil, the Umbertel Prize for Best Foreign Correspondent. He will be speaking today on some aspects of his latest book. That book deals with Brazil. Brazil is a country vast in scope, great in potential, that is realizing at this point a great deal of its enormous potential. It's a country that has gone through economic and political transitions, disequilibria, and it seems on a path that's destined to put it on the world stage as a major player. Larry has had a front row view of these transformations, and he'll be talking to us today about some of his observations and what he's written in his book. Title of the talk, Brazil on the Rise, the Story of a Country Transformed. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Larry Rohter.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, first of all. I'm sorry I couldn't have brought some Brazilian weather with me. Woke up this morning and saw that it was 8 below, so I logged on. I looked to see what the temperature was in Rio, and it was 95, so 103-degree difference. Well, I'm always happy to talk about Brazil. This is the first presentation I'm doing, actually, in calendar year 2014. And so there's a whole bunch of new issues that I can talk about and intend to talk about. This is a big year for Brazil for a couple of reasons. There's a presidential election in October, and that's always interesting and crucial to the path the country's going to take. But it's also the year that Brazil is going to be hosting the World Cup of Soccer in the summer, our summer, their winter. And that's the first of two global sporting events that Brazil is hoping will allow it to showcase itself on the world stage in the same way that other countries have done in the past. South Africa with the World Cup in 2006, 10, the last one. Of course, I'm referring to the Rio Olympics of 2016. We all know about the Beijing Olympics and what that did for China, the Tokyo Olympics. So Brazil is thinking along the same lines. And you know, it's a moment for Brazil to project itself because over the last 30 or so years, the country has, as the title of my talk indicates and the subtitle of my book, been a country transformed. Brazil today is either the sixth or seventh largest economy in the world, depending how you calculate things. It is the third largest democracy in the world after India and the United States. And all of this stands in contrast to, well, certainly the Brazil that I first visited in 1972, which was a military dictatorship, and with an economy that was largely oriented to the production of a few agricultural products. So I want to talk a bit about this year, but I want to give you context, first of all, so that in the Q&A we can really range over all the pertinent issues of the last 30 or so years. And so I want to talk to you a bit about how Brazil came to this position that it's currently in, a flourishing democracy with the world's sixth largest economy, let's say. Now, you know, this democratic transition really began 30 years ago as Brazil was emerging from a military dictatorship that had come into power in 1964. And unlike, you know, a lot of countries that we've seen recently, for example, you know, some of the Arab countries where the transition from to democracy from dictatorship has been bloody and violent, Brazil was able to do this in a largely pacific fashion through negotiations, and the military stepped down peacefully. I would argue that really they were quite exhausted by the experience of governing the country for 21 years. But you know, since then, you've seen you know, one presidential election after another conducted peacefully. You have a country with a flourishing press, religious institutions that speak out, civic institutions, an environmental movement, a flourishing civil society that's still growing and developing. The latest example of that we saw last summer when mass demonstrations erupted in Brazil's large cities, and some smaller cities too, to protest what a lot of people thought was excessive spending and corruption associated with these two global sporting events I'm talking about, the World Cup and the Olympics. We're talking about money that was going to be going into stadium construction, broader infrastructure, modernization. And you know, you look at the government's reaction. The president, Dilma Rousseff, she said, you know, rather than responding by declaring martial law or sending in the army, as a lot of other countries have done, she said, no, you know, this is a healthy manifestation. We have to sit down and talk with these people. And you'll notice that I said the president of Brazil is a she. And that's part of the democratic transition we've seen over the last 30 years as well. We've had presidents from the northeast of the country, which is traditionally the most backward part of the country and excluded in the past from the country's political life. Political power had been tended to be centered in this triangle here: Sao Paulo, Rio, Brasilia. And you had a president from Maranhão come in. Then he was succeeded by a president from Alagoas. Eventually, neither of them had particularly distinguished presidencies, I would say. But then you had an academic elected president. And how many times do you see that, a sociologist become president of a country, put in a position where he can put into practice his own theories? And then he was succeeded by a labor union leader of peasant descent, again from the Northeast, from the state of Pernambuco. I'm talking about Lula, who became very well known, and now a female president. Well, some of my Brazilian friends say to me, well, you know, we've completed our democratic transition. We've covered all the bases. And I say to them, no, not yet, because you haven't yet had a black president. And we're talking about a country where the majority of the population, 203 million people is the estimate that's given for this year, the majority of the people, you know, can trace their ancestry to Africa. And yet there has never been a black president. So that's, you know, that's something that the country needs to deal with down the line, to be even more democratic, greater representation in line with the composition of the population. But I'm trying to make the larger point that there has been this democratic transition from a right-wing military dictatorship to what is a political system that has many features that are worth emulating. It has some other features. I've mentioned corruption. I've mentioned, I would also add there's a certain kind of corporatist element to the way the political system works. But Brazil is a functioning democracy, and Brazilians are quite justifiably proud of the fact that they've made this transition, which other countries are struggling to do so. Now, that kind of sets the stage on the political side. On the economic side, and I talking about politics first, because I think that the political opening beginning in 1985, when the military stepped down, it set the stage for the economic growth to come. Because one of the tasks that the Brazilians had to deal with was, what kind of economic model do we want? What kind of country do we want to be economically? It's not, the Brazilian economic model is not one that was imposed on the population. And when I say that, I'm referring to a country like China. Everybody talks about the BRIC group. There's less talk of it these days, but over the last decade, Brazil, Russia, India, China have been lumped together as this group of emerging economies. And of the four, Brazil and India are clearly in the democratic side, Russia and China not. So the Brazilians had this vigorous debate about, well, how do we want to grow? What are our priorities? And the first decade really was a process of stumbling almost. There were economic policies that were tried and failed, but beginning in June of 1994 is when I date the start of Brazil's modern economic expansion. So we're coming up on 20 years, it'll be this year. And the principal challenge for every government in Brazil in modern times, military and civilian, has been the issue of inflation. And the first decade, Brazil really grappled with this and did not do well. I can remember being in Brazil on vacation in early 1991. And in that month, inflation was 70%. It was a year, you had years where inflation was over 1,000%. You can't have growth in those circumstances. You can for a while, but not sustained growth. So task number one was kill inflation. And that was done successfully in 1994 and 95 with the so-called Real Plan, the implantation of a new currency, and policies to build up reserves. I mean, I'm happy to talk about this if somebody wants to raise it in the Q&A session afterwards, but I don't want to dwell on it too much here because I'm kind of doing a broad presentation. But feel free later on. But once inflation was conquered, and by which I mean brought down from 4 digits to 1, it created the conditions for growth, because suddenly people, their money was worth something. They could save. They could buy products on time. It used to be that when you got your salary, you spent it as quickly as possible because you knew it would erode over the course of a month. And with the stability that conquering inflation brought, people were able to buy, and I'm talking about the whole population, because the conquest of inflation brought lots of people into the economy, people who were just barely hanging on, and it made them consumers. They could buy a television set, a refrigerator, an air conditioner on time. They could buy a house with a mortgage, things that weren't possible before. And so you had a spurt of growth, domestic market that became large and vigorous and remains so to this day. Now, that was accompanied by some fundamental changes on the macro level, in which Brazil consciously set out to broaden its trading partners so as to become less dependent on a single market, a single partner, that of the United States, and moved into a situation where it trades pretty much equally with North America, East Asia, and Europe. Now, this pattern of diversification wasn't just geographic. Brazil was also working on becoming both an agricultural and an industrial power. And this is also something that distinguishes it from the other members of the so-called BRIC group. India and China don't really have the territory that they can open up and devote to agriculture. Russia doesn't have the climatic conditions that allow that. Brazil does. And through scientific and technical research, its development of new kinds, new breeds of crops, it has become the foremost agricultural producer in the world. Let me go to the map here. The key thing, soybeans are probably the best example. The forecast for 2014 is just out, and Brazil is going to surpass the United States this year as the largest soybean producer in the world. It's been the largest exporter, but it's also going to now become the largest producer. Those are the forecasts, at least, for 2014, both in Brazil and here in the U.S. And, in 1974, that's 40 years ago, that wasn't the case. The Brazilian government scientific and technical research institution developed 40 different varieties of soybeans that were suitable for production in the tropics. And they also came up with a way of opening up a vast swath of territory that had not been thought suitable for agriculture. I'm going to go to the map again. We're talking about this area here, all of this in the interior, which has become the breadbasket of Brazil as a result of this research. And Brazil has become this vast agricultural power. It's the #1 producer and or exporter of, well, everybody knows coffee, right? I mean, there's that Frank Sinatra song from, I don't know, the 1950s. There's an awful lot of coffee in Brazil, and that's the one product that was most associated with Brazil. But soybeans, oranges, beef. The Brazilian cattle herd is the largest in the world, twice the size of that of the United States. Let's see, did I say oranges? Cocoa, sugar. There's a list of 9 or 10 products in which Brazil is either the leading producer or exporter. And, industry and services rise and fall, but people always have to eat. And so that's a kind of bedrock for the Brazilian economy. And now, there's environmental questions associated with this agricultural expansion, and I'm happy to talk about those in the Q&A if somebody wants to raise them. I just want to acknowledge that I'm aware of them and that they're much talked about in Brazil. But now, besides the agriculture, Brazil is also an industrial producer. I mentioned all those refrigerators and air conditioners and TV sets. Those are all made in Brazil. And you're talking about a market now of 200+ million people, and they're buying things, and largely from their domestic producers. As a result, foreign companies want to get involved. They invest as well. And it's funny because there are some years when Brazil's #1 export item is soybeans. There are other years when the #1 export item is airplanes. The third largest aircraft manufacturer in the world is Embraer, a Brazilian company, right here in São José dos Campos. So Brazil has tried to have a foot in each camp, to be an agricultural power and also a rising industrial power. The second part is harder, and we can discuss that further in the Q&A if someone wants to go in that direction. I understand there's a lot of econ majors here today. And I would add that Brazil is also in a privileged position because of its energy sources. We all know, here's the Amazon River, the world's largest river basin watershed, but there's also the Paraná River, there's the São Francisco River. All of this makes Brazil a hydroelectric source of the highest order. Canada and Brazil up there at the top of the list. And very little of that has been developed. There are some dams in the Amazon. There's one that's the center of a controversy right now. It's supposed to be right here. Would be the second largest dam in the world if constructed. So hydropower is one. You have a program highly developed to use ethanol in automobiles and cars. That's been going on also for 40 years. Took a long time to come to fruition, but now almost every vehicle in Brazil runs on an engine, on a motor that what they call flex fuel. It can run on gasoline, it can run on ethanol from sugarcane is what I'm talking about. Sorry, I should have clarified that. Or a mixture of the two. And Brazil is also exporting ethanol technology to other countries, other parts of the world. So that's a second leg. And then beginning in 2008, there were large discoveries of oil and gas offshore in this stretch here from off of São Paulo, off of Rio, and up to Espírito Santo. That's just starting to be developed. The estimates range all over the place, up to 86 billion barrels, plus lots of gas that won't be flared but brought in by pipeline into or shipped to land refineries. So Brazil's in a unique position as regards energy sources as well, and we're talking long term here. Not just this year and next year. It's going to take them a long time and a lot of money to develop all these sources, and it's a subject of great political debate in the country how they should be developed. But again, this is part of the democratic process, and they'll find their way. So where does that put Brazil today? Well, as I said, 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. Aspirations to pass France in the next couple of years, become the 5th largest economy in the world. And all of these ambitions to play a larger role on the world stage as befits, the 5th, 6th, 7th, whatever, largest economic power. The World Cup and the Olympics are part of that. A campaign for a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council is another part of that. Greater Brazilian involvement in international organizations besides the UN is a part of that. But there are impediments, and I want to acknowledge those. Growth has slowed from where it was in 2010, 2011, 7% in 2010, a third of that in 2013. Infrastructure problems, the burst of growth has led to strains on highways, airports, ports, human capital as well. There's just too much demand for workers, trained and skilled workers, for the educational system to supply, and that education system has become a real bottleneck, subject of great deal of criticism, and one of the manifesting itself in the demonstrations last June and July as one of the chief things, along with better health care, that the protesters were talking about. Those two issues are going to be the big center of controversy in the presidential election that will be coming up in October, and again, subject of national debate. I also worry, specifically in terms of the World Cup and the Olympics, that endemic corruption is going to be a problem. Stadiums that will be shoddily built, not finished on time, with all kinds of under-the-table payments to people and companies involved in the construction. There's a chance for both the World Cup and the Olympics not to run efficiently or smoothly, which would be a black eye for Brazil and not the shining moment of glory that it is hoping for. So, I'm always attentive to that. And then the way politics is in Brazil, if the country doesn't win the World Cup at home, a lot of people are going to say, what, we spend all that money, those billions of dollars, and we didn't even win the World Cup? Because Brazil has won the World Cup more than anybody else 5 times, and hungry for that 6th one. Politicians in Brazil always talk about how the World Cup outcome translates into satisfaction or dissatisfaction in the presidential election that follows a couple of months later. We'll see if that has an impact this time out. Same issues going as we head into the Rio 2016 Olympics. But overall, I'm pretty optimistic about Brazil. Now, I know right now that on Wall Street there's a certain faddishness. Everybody was bullish on Brazil in 2010, and now everybody is bearish on Brazil. I think that's largely the result of taking a short-term view and not a long-term view. I've emphasized in this presentation I'm making to you the long-term structural factors that will make Brazil continue to grow and flourish and prosper, rather than quarter-to-quarter short-term factors. There's a school of thought that Brazil's economic model is too statist. I share some of those concerns. I think the oil development and some of the agricultural development need to be more open to foreign investment and foreign technology. But one area in which Brazil has distinguished itself is that this growth, rather than contributing to broader income disparity, as we've seen in our own country and many other places, that the wealth has been used to narrow those gaps. And that's unique. Certainly within the BRIC group it's unique, and even in the industrialized world it's unusual. So you have, as a result of this process I'm talking about over the last 20 years, you have seen 40 to 50 million people lifted out of poverty and into middle class, lower middle class situations, where they can buy these consumer goods I'm talking about, buy a car, participate in the economy. So you have this global debate about what is the purpose of growth? What is it for? Who is it supposed to benefit? And the Brazilians provide a clear model, the notion that everybody should benefit to some extent from growth and prosperity. And on the other extreme, you have something like China, which is really statist, And you know, income disparity is growing, as I said, is the case in the United States as well. So Brazil has a unique model, a clear model. It's a model that's open to criticism. It's being widely criticized. But every time I read some negative take on Brazil, oh, it needs to be growing faster, they need to be relentless in pursuit of growth like the Chinese, I remember what Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the president of Brazil, for 2 terms beginning in 1995, said to me once in 1999 when I went to interview him. And Brazil was then in one of these phases where everybody on Wall Street was bearish about Brazil. Oh, Brazil, Brazil, Brazil. And he said to me, look, when they were, you know, when everybody was talking about how wonderful Brazil is, I never thought that things were as good then as they were painted at that time. And now that they're talking negatively about Brazil, I don't think things are as bad as they're painting them right now. And I always think of that because these things are cyclical. The world markets blow hot and cold on Brazil. And, you know, Brazil's in a moment where it's being, well, all the developing countries are, you know, under siege right now. Brazil less so than some others. But it's a moment of reassessment. And that's partly what the election campaign that's now beginning is going to be about. Where do we go? How do we get to the next level? How do we get growth without reverting to the problem of income distribution that we've had historically in our country? So I guess at that point, I'll stop and throw things open to questions from here and from Washington too, I guess. And if you folks, okay. And if you don't mind, I may munch a little bit on a sandwich now that I've earned my lunch.
Yes, now you can eat. We do have 2 audiences, and I wanted to make an announcement about the structure of the Q&A and one other announcement before we begin with the Q&A. We are going to end at 1:30, and afterwards Larry will be delivering a career conversation to Middlebury students in this room, but his public lecture will end at 1:30. And we're going to structure the Q&A beginning with this audience here at Middlebury, and for about 15 minutes, 10 minutes or 12 minutes, and then we will shift to Washington, D.C., and we will take questions from our sister audience in Washington. So beginning here, I would like to reserve the first wave of questions for any students that are in attendance that may have a question for Larry. Here comes the sentence. So you also need to use this microphone so that we can hear you here and our audience in Washington, D.C. can hear you. Questions?
Hi. So I was wondering, in your book you talked about the system of like os jeitinhos and the how the sort of small scale corruption to get things done.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you thought to what extent corruption is good for like greasing the wheels and getting things moving, and to what extent that makes a transaction cost too high and actually slows things down.
Well, I mean, traditionally, the jeito and the jeitinho are devices used to respond to the inefficiency of institutions or the inflexibility. So they're not totally negative. And as I also say in the book, I've used them myself in certain situations that you face in daily life living in Brazil. But one of the things that worries me is with this boom in the Brazilian economy over, let's say, the last 15 to 20 years, the scale, the size of corruption, I mean, it used to be penny ante stuff. Now you're talking about huge, huge amounts of money. And it is a drag. There is this thing that people talk about, the Brazil cost, which refers to the bureaucracy and all the procedures you have to go through to like set up a business. And you know, it's a real thing, and you can grease the wheels. There's an institution called the despachante. You hire someone as your dispatcher who handles all the bureaucratic nonsense. Well, it's not all nonsense, but you know, all the rigmarole that's involved. So yeah, it's a drag, but you know, I don't want to single out Brazil for criticism because you know, I've been a correspondent in a lot of places, and you know, Mexico, Indonesia, Philippines, China, a lot of places I've worked, and I'm from Chicago. So, you know, I want to, and I live now in New Jersey. So, you know, I don't want to point a finger, you know, exclusively at the Brazilians. It's part of human nature and human institutions.
Another question. Student?
I actually have two questions.
Okay.
So the first question is, you've said that Brazil has done a very good job in addressing the issue of income inequality better than the other BRICS countries.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any lessons that the other BRICS countries can learn from Brazil?
Well, yes, I think. Because what underlies the having a government that pursues reducing income inequality as a policy is democracy. If everybody has a voice and everybody is voting and there are multiple political parties and a free press and free labor unions, then you have the conditions in which those kind of demands arise and can be met. That's not the case in at least two of the BRICS, Russia and China, and India. You know, India is closer to Brazil, but you know, even beyond the BRIC group, I mean, other developing countries in Latin America and Asia, you know, I'm a big believer in democracy. You know, I think that creates the preconditions for the kind of policy that Brazil is pursuing, because the people in power know that there are rewards for success in this area. They're driven by the same motives that politicians are everywhere in the world, and there's accountability.
My second question
Sure.
is about the free press, and as you are a journalist and a correspondent in foreign countries, have you met with a lot of problems in covering issues in China and finding it easier to do that in Brazil?
Oh, much easier.
And
I mean, I was a correspondent in China 30 years ago, actually, you know, exactly 30 years ago. And for one thing, I couldn't travel freely. I would ask to go to a certain part of the country, and I'd be told, 不方便, it's not convenient. You know, in Brazil, I could go anywhere. In Brazil, I can talk to anybody, multiple sources. You know, I've worked in other countries like Cuba, where it's very difficult to be able to talk freely and openly and honestly with sources. You know, I've had problems in Brazil sometimes too. You know, I've written things that offended the government and made them really, really mad at me. But you know, democratic institutions function for the most part in Brazil, and they allow the foreign press and the domestic press to be very outspoken. Okay.
I'm Mr. Rohter. Thanks for
Hey.
coming. You briefly mentioned that Brazil and other developing countries are under siege by the United States. Do you mind talking a little bit more about that?
Well, not by the United States government so much as the markets. You know, I'm not a big fan of Wall Street thinking, which I think tends to be lemming-like. But since you raised the issue of the United States, I mean, I didn't talk in the presentation about the bilateral relationship between the United States and Brazil, which is a little bit tense right now, largely because of the Edward Snowden material that's come to light in Brazil. And the Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff postponed, maybe even canceled, we'll see, a visit to the U.S. It was supposed to be in last October. So there's tension in that relationship. You know, the United States is trying to get over that. I mean, I'm just reading the Brazilian papers this morning. The U.S. is trying to mend some fences and invited Brazil to be a participant in these multi-party talks under the UN auspices about what to do about Syria. And you know, Brazil wants to be have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, so you would think Brazil would be eager to be part of that discussion. No. Stand back. Whereas Kerry is involved in all sorts of other foreign ministries are involved. Brazil initially didn't want to go at all and has now sent a low-level delegation. So, you know, Brazil's foreign relations, specifically or particularly with the U.S., are complicated. But I didn't mean to to suggest that the Brazilian government is under siege from the U.S. government. Quite the contrary. I think the U.S. government would like a warmer relationship. It's just that, you know, the money is what's got Brazil under siege, and all the rest of the group.
Hello. As Director of International Politics and Economics, let me thank you for your focus on the political economy. I thought that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Really, really informative.
I was warned in advance, you know, that it would be helpful if I did that.
Yeah. Well, so I do want to pick up, though, because I actually study race politics.
Oh, yeah.
I want to pick up on your cue early on in your talk about the socio-demographics of Brazil. And I was lucky enough to go on a CIEE exchange to Brazil for 10 days in 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically 20 American academics from all over the United States, all different types of institutions, essentially being walked through the economics of Brazil by a series of speakers, while all of us were saying, what about race?
Mm-hmm.
And people seemingly studiously avoiding exposing us to discussions of race, or at least in the depth and detail that we wanted. So I know there's been a lot of movement since then. There's affirmative action now. That shocked me to learn that Brazil went in that direction. There have been a lot of studies that show just the deep divide between black and white life chances in Brazil. So does Brazil need to focus more on race? Does it need a civil rights movement? What would that look like? What would happen if it doesn't come about? Is there the potential for that to be something that undermines the Brazilian success story?
Yeah, I mean, I think Brazil does need to focus more on race. I'm not sure that a civil rights movement a la the U.S. is the answer. It doesn't seem to be a Brazilian way of doing things. But the problem is very much there, and it's complicated by the fact that definitions of race are different in Brazil. It's harder to draw a line between black and white because you have, you know, as they used to say when I first lived in Brazil in the 70s, temos todas as cores do arco-íris. We have all the colors of the rainbow. And it's, you know, the fundamental question is, who is black in Brazil? How is black defined? And you need to resolve that before you can take remedies to deal with what is clearly a historical issue. Slavery began in Brazil 100 years before it began in the United States. It lasted for another 25 years. You know, and you know, I say in Brazil openly to people that Brazil is a country with a racial problem, and I get pushback all the time. But you know what? That's the first step towards starting a debate, and recognizing that you have a problem is the first step in being able to grapple with that problem. And you know, I think Brazil needs to do more of that in order to deal with this issue.
Larry?
Yeah.
We have 2 questions over here, maybe 3. I'd like to combine those because we need to shift to Washington, D.C.
Okay.
So these will be the last 3.
All right.
Make your questions quick and short, and Larry will address them shortly and quickly.
Where did the capital investment equipment that fueled this agricultural and industrial expansion or development come from? Was it foreign or domestic sources? And how open has Brazil traditionally been to like foreign competition in consumer goods and like refrigeration, the like you mentioned?
I can answer that real quickly. Okay. Let me do that. The bulk of the equipment is domestically made, and Brazil always wants technology transfer agreements when it signs with a company, you know, that's coming in. So that's the first part. And the second part was, yeah, I mean, the complaint always is that Brazil isn't open enough. But no matter how much Brazil opens, the complaint is always the same. So, you know, it gets to a point where, okay, well, what do you want it to be? You know, there is an issue of sovereignty. So, yeah, that's the answer to that.
So my question is about soy and
Yeah.
the production and export of soy.
Yeah.
Argentina had large issues with that a few years ago, and
Right.
be in that. How did Brazil deal with that or grapple with the issues of the economic disparity that the export and lack of import due to the soy created?
Well, I mean, that's another technical question I can answer quickly, too. I mean, you know, Brazil and Argentina have taken diametrically opposed policies as regards agricultural exports. When I was in Argentina, you know, a decade ago as well, they were taxing the exports. Brazil doesn't do that kind of thing. It does everything it can to encourage exports, and you know, the other factor here is that there's a much greater level of technological innovation in Brazil because there's more research and, you know, a larger territorial expanse, larger growing area. All those things, I think, give Brazil a leg up on Argentina. Yeah.
So going back to the income inequality reduction program
Sure.
that started, in my understanding, with Lula.
No.
Or
Much earlier,
or
yeah.
Much earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but it's my understanding is that the very controversial or, you know, notorious Bolsa Familia has been at the center of that. I mean,
Yes.
I'm wondering, and you can do a much better job than I can at explaining
Sure.
to the audience what that is. But I'm wondering what your view of Bolsa Familia is and whether the program has developed over the last, I don't know, 8 years or however long it's been used.
Bolsa Familia is the name given to a program where the Brazilian government gives a monthly stipend to the poorest families in the country. The amount of that stipend varies. It's under $100 a month, but when you're really poor, it makes a big difference. You know, politicians like to claim credit for everything that they do, even if somebody did it earlier. And the truth is that Bolsa Familia is based on an earlier program called Bolsa Escola, you know, a stipend given to parents to send their kids to school. And that dates back to the mid-90s. Now, Lula, his government, expanded it, gave it a new name, broadened it. But it's been no matter what you call it or who you give credit to, it's been a very effective device in combating poverty and helping lift people, you know, in making them consumers, putting them into the middle class, albeit the lower middle class. Why is it controversial? Well, I mean, in this country, anything that's distributionist is controversial. I mean, look at our own 2008 campaign. It's not controversial in Brazil. Even the right-wing parties agree that this is the path that the country should be taking.
Okay, let's shift to Washington, D.C. Are there questions for Mr. Rohter? Please state your question.
Thank you very much. I've lived in Brazil for about 10 years on my life, and I'm way out of date, so I appreciate the updates provided. I have two quick questions. One, when I left Brazil about 20 years ago, the conventionalism was that there's three countries, not one. There's the South, there's the middle Northwest,
Right,
and then
right.
the North. And one of the things that held back economic advance was the lack of integration of those three parts of the country. I wonder, comment on
Sure.
the strides towards integrating the different parts of the country.
Okay, I'm going to step back towards the map. I trust my voice will project. Okay, we're talking. Here's what's generally considered the Northeast. 50 to 60 million people, and the pattern had always been that people migrated to the industrial cities in the South: Belo Horizonte, São Paulo, Rio. This is like our own flow from the from the south to Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland in reverse. But these policies that I'm talking about, and you left just as things were starting to change, you had the Bolsa Familia payments lift families in this region out of poverty. And also, you now see companies opening factories and plants and all kinds of economic activity up here. This area right here, Petrolina Juazeiro, has become an industrial hub. There's another one here, Caruaru. They're emerging as mid-size industrial centers. So there's been that integration between the northeast and the southwest, the traditional center of the country. The north still remains a bit of a problem. It's more integrated too, thanks to better communications, better highways, more emphasis on riverine transport. But the Amazon jungle is there, and there are limits to what you can do. So I'd say integration, south of here, and this area here, has really picked up, but there's still challenges to be faced in the north. Okay.
I'm sorry. Can I ask you another one?
Sure.
Could you comment on Brazil's foreign policy? Does it have a foreign policy? What is its aim? What does it hope to advance through its foreign policy?
And if I could piggyback on that as well. Foreign policy, perhaps contemporary foreign policy, and maybe foreign policy a bit in the past vis-a-vis Argentina. At one time, there was an intense nuclear rivalry, political rivalry between those two.
Yeah, let me respond to your question first, since it's a historical one in a way. Yes, the traditional rivalry between Brazil and Argentina was, for a long time, occupied Brazilian foreign policy specialists. Brazil has always had a professional foreign ministry. Itamaraty is what it's called, named after the palace in Rio where it was based. And a great tradition of being good negotiators. That's how Brazil got the borders it has, through crafty negotiation with neighboring countries that weren't antagonized in the process. But the Brazil-Argentina rivalry was a big one. And at the time when both countries had military dictatorships that were strongly nationalistic, the two of them were really suspicious of each other. I'm talking about, the period 70s and early to mid 80s, when both countries had nuclear programs going, each thinking that the other was a threat. When civilian rule returned in both countries, Alfonsín in Argentina, José Sarney in Brazil, one of the first things they did in terms of their foreign policy was to cool things down. And they signed an agreement allowing mutual inspection of each other's nuclear programs and a broader agreement to do away with those programs. And to the immense credit of both countries, that was achieved by 91. And so you diffused a potential nuclear arms race that could have been as tense as India and Pakistan. Completely gone as an issue. And the two countries became partners in the Mercosur trade group. They don't particularly like each other even these days, but they've learned to get along. On the soccer field, forget it. But the nuclear issue has been completely resolved. So now, so that's the historical issue. Current Brazilian foreign policy. There's a story that a Brazilian foreign minister told me many years ago about Henry Kissinger coming to visit the foreign ministry palace in Brasilia. And the foreign minister, his name was Antônio Azeredo da Silveira. He's taking Kissinger around, showing him, the magnificent glass and metal combinations. An Oscar Niemeyer building, he designed it. And at the end, the Brazilian foreign minister says to Henry Kissinger, "So Henry, what do you think?" And Kissinger says to him, "Antonio, I think it's magnificent. Now all you need is a foreign policy to go with it." And now, granted, that's 30-odd years ago, But I think Brazil is still, in a way, searching for a coherent foreign policy. It tends to be reactive to individual events, not. There are people doing long-term thinking, but they don't tend to be in positions of influence. And so, when crises come along, it's like, oh, we're kind of caught by surprise. How do we react? And sometimes Brazil's ambitions get the best of it. I don't know if folks here remember a couple of years ago when the Iranian nuclear issue was dominant at the UN. Brazil and Turkey came together to, with a proposal that the United States and the Western powers didn't like at all, and it got to be a mess. I think Brazil overreached a little bit there, as it tends to do. But those are growing pains. It's not easy to find your legs, your sea legs, when the world is, topsy-turvy. Things are so crazy. And I think as Brazil gains more experience at playing the game at the highest level, at major league level or the soccer equivalent of it, Brazilian experience and the deftness with which it can be a negotiator will become helpful in making Brazil a player on the world stage. I mean, the point is that it's got a seat at the table now, unlike any other Latin American country. It's no longer focused just on its region. It's oriented towards the world and being a world player, and it has a seat at the table. Now, it's a question of developing the skill and the expertise and having the experience to use that opportunity to best effect. Thank you.